Moving on, let's get started with this 12-mark question. With reference to extract A, paragraph 3, discuss whether the rail network can be considered a natural monopoly. Now that is quite a unique question, and let's have a look at paragraph 3 of extract A. So it is this paragraph here, which is talking about renationalisation. So privatisation, meanwhile, never really worked. The rail network of, and that is very significant, 2,500 stations and 32,000 kilometres of tracks was renationalised. Essentially, we're looking for arguments that it is a natural monopoly, and towards the end it talks about how they want they want to remove this network rail natural monopoly, and so companies can bid for it. So we're talking a lot about natural monopolies. Let's, of course, is 12 marks. We're going to be drawing the diagram here, as it really does help to explain. It just puts all that theory into context. So cost/revenue on your y-axis, then quantity on your x-axis, output, whatever you want to mention. But now, what is the unique thing about your natural monopoly diagram? Of course, the LRAC looks a bit different. We just do not suffer diseconomies of scale at all. It just continues to decrease. What is another curve you can add with this? You have your LRAC, then you have your LRMC, which is just vertically below your LRAC at each point. Then what are the other two curves we are missing compared to a monopoly diagram? Of course, we have our demand curve, which is D equals AR. And then what is our last curve? We have our MR curve, which would look something like this. MR. But now let's actually think about the first characteristics, which is huge sunk costs. So in the extract it mentions here, so where we just read, the rail network of 2,500 stations and 32,000 kilometers of tracks, which of course represents high fixed costs. Now, how does the diagram represent these huge fixed/sunk costs? But how does the diagram represent these huge fixed costs? The thing you need to understand is these huge fixed costs are paid only once. So for example, 2,500 train stations, and you can see this on the diagram. Initially, at the low quantities, the costs are extremely high, is extremely expensive. But now, once we've built that train station, we don't need to build it again. It's a fixed cost that we don't need to spend again. Therefore, the cost for adding one extra unit, for example, that might be one extra passenger, one extra train, is extremely low. So what I'm saying, the marginal cost of adding one extra passenger is low, therefore this is why we see our LRMC slope downwards and continues to decrease. And then those huge fixed costs, the more passengers that use that train station, those huge fixed costs are spread across more units, thus meaning as more people consume the trains, the railways, it means that the long-run average cost continues to fall until, of course, it reaches its MES, which is the minimum efficient scale. But the main thing there, the LRAC sloping downwards, the L-shaped LRAC represents long-run average cost falling. The average cost per passenger is falling. As like I said, you only pay those huge fixed costs once, and therefore then they spread over the more passengers that consume them. The huge fixed costs are spread over more customers. But why does this link to the characteristics of a natural monopoly? As this shows, it's naturally most efficient for one firm to serve the entire market, for one firm to dominate the entire market. So therefore, only one firm has to pay these huge sunk costs, and they serve all the customers, meaning that they can reduce their LRAC as much as possible, spread that large fixed cost across as many passengers, as many customers as possible, compared to if we duplicated. For example, if there's competition in the market, and for example, instead of building one of the train stations in London, they built two exact same ones. Of course, that would mean two firms have to suffer those extremely high fixed costs, and then there's less passengers to spread those high fixed costs across, therefore leading to massive waste and a massive misallocation of resources. So of course, like I said, it's naturally most efficient because it's productively efficient for one firm to dominate the market, and if there's duplication, it's a massive misallocation of resources. That is a great first paragraph you can speak about, and of course there's lots of different paragraphs you can talk about with regards to this question. Since of course the second paragraph, the second characteristic we were talking about were the huge economies of scale. That is one of the main features of a natural monopoly, and of course you can see that via LRAC massively decreasing, reaching its minimum efficient scale. And of course, all I would do whenever you talk about economy of scale, go into depth with one or two. So the main one, of course, being here is purchasing economies of scale. Of course, we're talking about the railways, the 32,000 worth of tracks. Of course, with purchasing economy of scale, of course, they're buying a large quantity of tracks, therefore massive size of order means that they have increased bargaining power, and they use that increased bargaining power to reduce the cost per unit. As for example, classic example, if you're buying 100 hamburgers and it's £100, you don't have much bargaining power, but if you're buying 10,000 hamburgers now cost per unit, you could probably negotiate a lot lower cost per unit than £1 per burger, since the overall size of your order is much bigger, like saying, thus giving you bargaining power, thus reducing your long run average cost. But also, let's not forget, this is a natural monopoly, so it definitely gives them a degree of monopoly power, since you can also have monopoly power in buyers' markets. Since why? They will be the sole buyer of railways in England. Therefore, as they're the sole buyer of railways in England, they can pretty much give these railway firms any price, and they have to accept. Why? Since these railway firms, the people who make like the actual tracks, the suppliers of the actual tracks, they have no one else to sell to, since the only person that buys the tracks is Network Rail, for example. So definitely, you can also add into the purchasing economy scale the degree of monopoly power they have. And it's a really interesting concept to keep in mind that monopoly power, yes, we usually speak about it in labour markets, but definitely exists in buyers' markets as well. Another great example of that is supermarkets. The big 6, 8 supermarkets like Sainsbury's, Aldi, Tesco, Asda, Lidl, they have a massive degree of monopoly power over farmers, and that has been one of the extracts in previous years in one exam paper. And of course, if you want a different paragraph point, which is a bit more related to the diagram itself, of course, if you guys are confident with labelling the allocative efficient points on these diagrams, since of course, where's allocative efficiency when MC equals AR, which is this point here, but of course, what's the problem with this point here? We will be charging a price of P1, but P1 is below our average costs. Therefore, with the allocative efficient price, and for some of you this might not make any sense, but for the allocative efficient price, our costs are higher than our price, thus meaning the point between these 2 points, so level at A, level at B, that would be the quantity of subsidy the government would have to provide to price at the allocatively efficient point. Well, that's another paragraph point you can speak about. But since, of course, this question is talking about discuss whether the railway network can be considered, you would have to give some points against or some evaluation points. So for the economy scale paragraph, I would probably just evaluate it to pick up those evaluation marks. With diseconomy scale, talk about alienation, bureaucracy, basically that manager's failure, and it can lead to diseconomy scale. And then for the first paragraph, I would probably evaluate this with the argument of competition, with if the number of firms, if there's a number of firms competing in the market, and then of course back it up with the extract, it could actually maybe lead to a better allocation of resources. And of course it does mention that they want firms to bid for this railway to upgrade the railway lines. So especially with things like technological change, maybe a new efficient firm could do better than this natural incumbent monopoly.